Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia. This episode is part 2 of our Margaret Catchpole and Mary Reibey stories. We hope you enjoy. Now, we know the story so far for Margaret Catchpole was that she had William Laud, her smuggler boyfriend, and she'd been blackmailed into stealing a horse by one of his old acquaintances to ride that horse to London, where she was captured and placed into Ipswich jail. Now, it is understood that she was in Ipswich jail for some time when she found out that apparently William Laud was also in the jail. So she made an escape to go and see him. Unfortunately, this resulted in him being shot and Margaret being taken back to Ipswich jail. Part 1 for Margaret left on the note that she was going to be transported to New South Wales, Australia, to the new colony that had been set up. But she was going to be transported now for life, so she would never return to her homeland of England again. This upset Eliza Cobbold, as Margaret had been her servant for many years and they'd grown a close bond, and Margaret had even saved some of her children. They stayed friends even though it was her horse that was stolen. By 1801, around middle of June, 95 other women, all gathered from different jails in the areas of England, were brought to the Nile, which was a convict ship that was going to be taking them to the New South Wales colony. It would be around a 176-day trip, or approximately 6 months, passing through a couple of places that Margaret had never been to before, including Rio de Janeiro. Now, there is also a very interesting story that unfolds aboard the Nile. There is a family who is also there, some free settlers. It was the Rouse family. Elizabeth and Richard Rouse, Mary 2 years old, and John Richard Rouse, who was actually born at sea on the 27th of August 1801. Now, it is said that Margaret actually assisted Elizabeth Rouse in the delivery of John Richard Rouse. She acted as a nursemaid to the children for the rest of the voyage. It seems Margaret was very good with children, and the families loved her for that. The Rouse family were given a grant in the Hawkesbury district for an area they named Richmond Hill, which is now known as North Richmond. He named his property Oxford Farm, after his English hometown, and it becomes a property that Margaret will come to know very well. Now, the Nile, along with the other 2 ships, Canada and Minorca, arrived in the December of 1801. It must have been very interesting for Margaret to disembark from the Nile and see such a foreign place. As we know at this time, being 1801, the settlement was now reaching around its 14th year, so there was quite a few buildings set up now. It wasn't just straight bush like what people would have experienced coming off the First Fleet, and it was common for the first people to be in the area, so Margaret would have been familiar with them quite early. Upon arriving in the new settlement, Margaret was assigned as a servant to a John Palmer, who had arrived on the First Fleet as a purser on the HMS Sirius, and he was a prosperous man now. She had also been approached by a man by the name of George Kelly. Apparently he had noticed Margaret and tried to court her, but her true love, William Laud, had been shot and died. Her heart was broken still, and it didn't seem like it would ever mend, at least not to accept intentions from other men. So she refused him, as she had John Barry all those years ago. Now, John Palmer had his farm at Woolloomooloo. We know this as Margaret writes to Eliza Cobbold in the January of 1802. She did have a little bit of education, we know, while she was with the Cobbolds, only slightly, as a lot of her words in her letters have been misspelled and are somewhat hard to read. But her letter proceeds, "As I was going to be landed on the left hand of me, it put me in mind of the cliff," probably meaning the cliff where the Cobbolds lived, "both the housen and likewise the hills, so as it put me in very good spirits, seeing a places so much like my own native home. It is a great deal more like England than ever I did expect to a seen, for here is garden stuff of all kinds." It looks as though Margaret is settling into the Port Jackson area quite well. We do understand that Margaret often writes to Eliza, and this has been said to have been the earliest known information about the Hawkesbury district. Her letters to Eliza are so precious because they explain all of the information that was happening at the time in the early 1800s that without these letters we would not have known. It would be interesting to know how these letters ended up back in Australia. It is understood that Margaret worked for John Palmer for some years before going to work with the Rouse family. It is understood that they must have sent for her, or if she'd finished up with John Palmer, perhaps she sought them out. In a letter to her aunt Anne and her uncle William Hose, back living in Ipswich in the Suffolk region, in 1806, she tells of how she's been living with the Rouse family for 2 years. She says, "Been for this 2 years past up in the country at Richmond Hill. I went there to nurse one of Mrs. Rouse's, a very respectful person. They came from England free. They respect me as one of their own family. Mr. Rouse did live up at Richmond at his farm, but the governor gave him a place to be superintendent and master builder at the lumber yard Parramatta. There then I was left overseer at his farm, but it was too lonesome for me, so I left. But I have got 4 yards and 9 breeding goats, 3 wethers and 7 young ones. That is all my stock at present. Mr. Rouse keep them and charge me nothing for them. I should had 6 pigs, but this place has been so flooded that I thought we must all been last, that how I came so very ill, being in the water up to my middle. As you well know, I have good spirit. I was trying to save what I could." Now these letters indicate that there was a big flood in the Hawkesbury area, and where she had gained some goats and maybe some other stock from the Rouses, she'd lost some of the pigs in the flood. It does say that she became ill while trying to save some of the stock, and there are some pictures from Richard Cobbold's book. Richard Cobbold, of course, being Eliza's son, that she had in 1797, just as Margaret Catchpole was being sentenced to Australia. He writes a book about Margaret's life, which he doesn't release until after her death in 1845, that illustrate these floods that she wrote back to Eliza and to her aunt Anne and Uncle William, recounting these awful stories from the Hawkesbury region. We understand there was a flood in 1806 and another in 1809 that Margaret tells about. Margaret also had letters to her aunt and uncle that she was going between 4 different families around this 1804 to 1806, helping with the young children as well as cooking for the households and cleaning. Mrs. Rouse, Mrs. Dites, Mrs. Wood, and Mrs. Pitt Faithful, who was Mrs. Wood's sister. All 4 women must have lent heavily on Margaret, as they all seemed to have babies in these 2 years. It is also understood that although they were writing letters to each other, Eliza and Margaret were also sending each other gifts. We know that Eliza Cobbold and some of the friends that Margaret must have known back in England were sending Margaret handkerchief, shawl, black lace, yards of material for caps and dresses. Even Mr. Stebbing, the doctor that had got her the job with the Cobbolds, as well as helping her save Mrs. Denton when she was quite young. They were sending her Bibles, prayer books, bobbins, and 4 yards of material with beautiful letters that came through as well. And this allowed Margaret to do a bit of trade in Richmond and the Hawkesbury area, as there were a lot more free settlers that were coming to Australia. So Margaret was really making a killing. But she did so well for herself, coming from nothing and with a little bit of help from people that she'd helped in the past. Really made a good life for herself. In a letter to Eliza in 1809, she said that she rented a small farm and hired a man to do the work on her land. So she must be doing quite well. It was around the time of the flood in 1809, but she did say that a lot of her stock was saved. By 1811, she had 30 sheep, 40 goats and 30 pigs. She had 2 dogs to protect herself because she lived alone, but she still had the man hired to plant corn and deal with all of the farm work. Now, Margaret was also approached by another man, a James Gordon, who wanted to be with Margaret. He was a botanist and he was sent to Sydney to find all kinds of skins and seeds to bring back to London for a wealthy man he worked for named Emperor John Alexander Woodford. This also allowed Margaret to send 2 lyrebird specimens back to Eliza Cobbold in England, and it is known that Eliza got quite a bit of attention back in England for these birds. We understand that Margaret received a pardon on the 31st of January 1814. She did not return to England, as she had acquired so much in Australia for herself at this time. Most likely she still had the farm and all the animals and was doing really well for herself. It is known that on May 13th, 1819, Margaret was buried at St. Peter's Anglican Church, near to the entry, located in Richmond. The events of her death was noted several years later in the Sydney Evening News on December 5th, 1890. It was on a letter to the editor that was written in by a George M. Pitt. He was 76 years old and recalled Margaret a nurse to his mother before her death. He went on to say that his father had a flock of sheep at Bronte, shepherded by a man named Tom, who had died through catching a heavy cold, influenza. Margaret had attended him, and she caught the same complaint and it carried her off. Unfortunately for Margaret, she had died nursing a sick shepherd back to health, but unfortunately it took them both. It's a great story of coming from nothing at all, but with the friendships that she gained along the way, helping and her servant jobs, she was able to build a life for herself. And even though she wasn't here that long, 18 years, she did a lot in that time. Now, Mary actually arrived before Margaret into the colony. Mary was sent aboard the Royal Admiral in 1792. This was in a time when the colony was only just getting sorted out, and it would have been quite a scary time for Mary. It is understood that Mary Haydock worked for Francis Gross and his wife as their nursemaid to little Francis Gross Jr., who'd been born just before they'd set off to Australia. Shortly after arriving, it is believed that Thomas Reibey approached Mary and started courting her. He was a junior officer on the store ship Britannia. As we know, Francis Gross was in charge of the New South Wales Corps, and perhaps Thomas Reibey had been to the Gross house and noticed Mary, and this is where he comes to court her. He tried a few times to propose to her, but she refused him on several occasions. Eventually, Mary agreed to marry Thomas on the 7th of September 1794. She was 17 years old when they married. Thomas Reibey was granted land in the Hawkesbury River area. They built a farmhouse called Reibey Croft. This house still stands and is heritage listed. There was actually a tour in 2018 of the farm, which is located in the now suburb of Freeman's Reach. Thomas began a cargo business along the Hawkesbury River to Sydney. His business undertakings prospered, enabling him in 1804 to build a substantial stone residence on a further grant of land near Macquarie Place. A park in this area is actually where the Sirius anchor is currently displayed, which we spoke about in one of our previous episodes. Thomas's business thrived, and he was able to acquire several farms on the Hawkesbury River. He traded in coal, cedar, furs and skins. He had a business partner by the name of Edward Wills, and the trading activities extended to Bass Strait, the Pacific Islands, and in 1809 to China and to India. I think it's amazing that both Mary and Margaret in 1809 were around the Hawkesbury area together, although it doesn't seem that they met or that their lives came together in any way. Although it may be that when Margaret sent those lyrebirds to Eliza Cobbold, they may have even used the cargo business that Thomas Reibey had, which would have sent the lyrebirds along the Hawkesbury River to Sydney and then off to England. It's not written down, but it may well have happened. Now, Mary and Thomas had 7 children. They were doing so well for themselves. However, tragedy struck on the 5th of April in 1811, when Thomas dies. In a strange turn of events, Thomas dies in the April, and Edward Wills, his business partner, dies in the May. It's understood that Thomas died due to a skin-related illness from all the sun that he had while travelling to India over the past 6 months. Perhaps Edward had the same fate. Either way, Mary and the 7 children now had no Thomas. But it didn't stop Mary. Mary assumed the sole responsibility for the businesses as well as the care of her children. It is actually interesting as to why she didn't call out to Margaret at the time. Margaret was looking after families in the area. Mary was no stranger to looking after the business on her own, as Thomas had often gone overseas or left Sydney for long periods of time for the business. In 1812, she opened a new warehouse in George Street, and in 1817 extended her shipping operations with the purchase of further vessels. Now, it does appear that the State Archive holds many records of extensive importing mercantile businesses, and there's a number of references to her business dealings with liquor licenses, land grants and purchases. This was a time where women weren't business people. It was left to the men to do this type of work. Women were having babies and looking pretty. Not for Mary Reibey. She was now a wealthy trader. In the 1820s, Mary had Reibey Croft extended for her daughter Penelope and son-in-law John Atkinson. Mary became a very close friend of Governor Lachlan Macquarie and his wife Elizabeth. Mary, along with both Lachlan and Elizabeth Macquarie, were part of 6 founding shareholders of the Bank of New South Wales in 1817, trading out of Mary's Macquarie Place house, the bank now known as Westpac. It appeared that Mary was selling off her assets in around 1820 to go back to England. But she returned to Sydney the next year. Her daughters accompanied her, but they must have realised that Australia was where they needed to be. Mary was appointed one of the governors of the Free Grammar School in 1825. She was involved in a lot of charity work and was well known for these dealings. Around 1830s, she builds a cottage in the suburb of Hunters Hill, known as Fig Tree House, a lovely building on the water's edge. It was on the shores of the Lane Cove River. However, when she retired, she built a house in Newtown where she lived until her death on the 30th of May 1855 from pneumonia, and she was 78 years old. They've placed Mary's face on the Australian $20 note. It's been printed with her face since 1994. It is known that Mary's oldest son, Thomas Haydock Reibey II, was a clergyman, farmer and politician. He was the Premier of Tasmania from 1876 to 1877. Mary's wealth enabled Thomas to build Enterley Homestead in 1819. This house is in Hadspen on the outskirts of Launceston in northern Tasmania and still stands today. We know Mary was printed on the $20 note to be admired for all of her charity and church work that she did over her years, and admired as the strong businesswoman that she was. Many of these houses still stand today, and a street in Sydney, Reibey Lane, has been named after her also. She is well commemorated, and you can see why many may have put Mary Reibey's ending on Margaret Catchpole's story. It seemed Margaret had such an interesting life before coming to Sydney, and then quite an interesting life while she was here. But Mary Reibey had an outstanding life while she was here. The businesses, the money, the charity work, she was famous here, and dealing with a lot of socialites like the Macquaries. Such interesting women. We had to make it 2 parts. We hope you enjoyed both of their stories. Stay tuned for our next episodes, where we look at the first unsolved murder in Australia, as well as the cannibal convict, and many more to come. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and tap on that notification bell so you're aware when we post more videos.